The moment someone calls 911 because you turned off your own water, you already know the truth is about to drown somebody. The low mechanical hum of the well pump faded into silence as I reached for the old brass shutoff valve that had been bolted to the concrete wall long before I was born. The familiar vibration disappeared beneath my fingertips, replaced by the quiet rustle of dry prairie grass rolling across my ranch under a pale Texas morning sky. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and every drop of water running beneath Caldwell Ranch belonged to my family long before the first HOA brochure ever promised luxury country living a mile down the road. That morning, I wasn't making a statement. I wasn't starting a fight. I was replacing a pressure regulator that had finally given up after nearly 30 years of faithful service. The replacement part sat neatly beside my toolbox, still smelling faintly of machine oil and fresh rubber packaging. My boots crunched across white limestone gravel as I checked the pressure gauges one last time before shutting everything down. It should have been a routine repair, one I'd done more times than I could count. Instead, less than 10 minutes after the water stopped flowing, I heard tires squeal on the county road, followed by the unmistakable sound of an expensive SUV charging through a cloud of dust toward my front gate. Victoria Harrington climbed out before the vehicle had fully stopped. Her perfectly pressed white blouse looked untouched by the summer heat, oversized sunglasses hiding everything except the tight smile she wore whenever she believed she was about to win. She marched across my driveway as though my ranch were another HOA sidewalk waiting for inspection. "You can't do that," she shouted before she was even close enough for a conversation. "Turn the water back on immediately." I wiped my hands with an old shop towel and looked toward the silent well house. "It's my well," I answered calmly. "I'm replacing a valve." Her smile vanished. "That water supplies the neighborhood pond, the entrance fountains, and half the irrigation system." I nodded once. "Not today." She stared at me for a long second, then pulled out her phone with dramatic precision. The faint scent of her expensive perfume drifted through the dry air, oddly out of place beside diesel, cedar posts, and warm earth. "Fine," she said. "We'll let the sheriff explain property law to you." I watched her dial 911 without taking another step. She described me as though I were sabotaging public infrastructure, insisting I had intentionally shut off essential community utilities. I almost laughed, but years of ranch life had taught me that patience usually outlasted panic. Somewhere beyond the oak trees, a windmill creaked in slow rhythm while red-tailed hawks circled high above the pasture. The only emergency on my property was a worn-out valve worth less than $200. Still, within minutes, distant sirens echoed across the rolling hills. Victoria folded her arms with complete confidence, convinced handcuffs would arrive before my wrench ever touched another bolt. What she didn't know was that every pipe beneath her prized neighborhood, every gallon feeding those fountains she loved showing off, and every legal right attached to that water had a history far older than her HOA. She believed she was calling the law against me. She had actually invited the law onto my side of the fence. The deputies had not arrived yet, but I could already see dust hanging over the county road in the distance. Victoria stood near her sport utility vehicle with one hand on her hip and the other gripping her phone like she had personally summoned justice. I did not say another word. Instead, I walked back into the well house and rested my hand against the weathered wooden beam my grandfather installed in 1968. The timber still carried the faint scent of old cedar mixed with grease from decades of maintenance. Every scratch on those walls had a story. Every wrench hanging above my workbench had belonged to someone in my family before it belonged to me. Caldwell Ranch covered just over 1,800 acres of rolling pasture, limestone ridges, and creek bottoms stretching farther than most visitors expected. Tourists driving past saw fences, cattle, and windmills. They never saw what really mattered. Beneath those fields rested the limestone aquifer that had supplied this land for generations. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, drilled the original production well after returning home from military service. My father expanded the pumping station when neighboring ranches struggled through one of the worst droughts in county history. Neither of them ever believed in wasting water, but both believed that if a neighbor needed help, you helped. That was how I was raised. Long before expensive houses appeared beyond the eastern fence line, local ranchers occasionally connected temporary irrigation hoses during emergencies with my father's permission. Everything was done with a handshake and mutual respect. Nobody confused kindness with ownership. That changed 12 years ago when the developer built Willow Creek Estates. Glossy advertisements promised peaceful ranch living with sparkling fountains, decorative ponds, and perfectly green entrance landscaping every month of the year. Most buyers never asked where that water came from. They simply enjoyed the view every time they drove through the stone entrance gates. The developers discovered an old agricultural connection that had once been installed with my father's written permission during a particularly dry summer. It was supposed to be temporary. Somehow temporary slowly became permanent after enough paperwork changed hands. My father never liked it, but he always believed people would eventually do the right thing. After he passed away, I inherited more than land. I inherited responsibility. Every inspection report, every maintenance log, every water quality test, every county permit sat organized inside steel filing cabinets in my office. I kept everything because ranch life teaches you that memories fade, but records endure. Victoria never cared about any of that. To her, the fountains, ponds, and emerald lawns were simply neighborhood amenities that should always work because homeowners paid monthly dues. She had probably never stepped inside a pump house or replaced a cracked pressure regulator under a blazing August sun. She saw water as a service. I saw it as something earned through decades of work, maintenance, taxes, and stewardship. As I picked up my socket wrench and examined the worn valve lying on the concrete floor, I realized this morning had never really been about a repair. It was about two completely different ideas of ownership quietly heading toward the same collision, and neither of us was willing to pretend they meant the same thing anymore. The first patrol vehicle rolled through my front gate just as I finished loosening the last rusted fitting from the old pressure regulator. Gravel cracked beneath the tires before the engine settled into a quiet idle. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped out first, removing his sunglasses as he looked from the silent well house to Victoria, standing with folded arms like she had already won the argument. His partner remained beside the truck, calmly taking notes while the morning breeze carried the smell of dry hay and fresh-cut cedar across the yard. Victoria wasted no time. She launched into a polished explanation about public utilities, community safety, and intentional disruption of essential services. She spoke with absolute certainty, pointing toward the neighborhood beyond the eastern ridge where decorative fountains had stopped flowing and sprinklers no longer hissed across carefully trimmed entrance lawns. Listening to her, anyone would have believed I had sabotaged an entire town. I leaned my wrench against the workbench and waited until she finished. Years on a ranch teach patience better than any classroom ever could. You do not rush a storm, and you do not interrupt someone determined to expose their own misunderstanding. Deputy Mills finally turned toward me. His voice stayed even. "Mr. Caldwell, can you explain what is happening today?" I simply nodded toward the open well house. "Routine maintenance. The main pressure regulator failed during inspection this morning. I shut down my private system so I could replace it safely." Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head. "Private system? That water supplies our community. Hundreds of homeowners depend on it." I looked past her toward the distant entrance monument where two stone fountains now sat perfectly still beneath the bright Texas sun. They had become the symbol of Willow Creek Estates. New residents posed for photographs there every spring. Real estate brochures proudly featured those fountains on nearly every cover. Nobody ever mentioned the aging well hidden inside my weathered pump house nearly 2 miles away. That silence had always bothered me more than I admitted. Deputy Mills asked another simple question. "Does the neighborhood own this well?" Victoria answered before I could even open my mouth. "The community has always used it." She stressed the word always as though repetition alone created ownership. I noticed the deputy writing something into his notebook before looking back at me. "Mr. Caldwell?" I answered just as calmly. Using something and owning something are not always the same. For the first time that morning, Victoria's confident smile flickered. It lasted only a second before she recovered and reached into a leather folder she had carried from her vehicle. Out came colorful neighborhood maps, landscaping plans, and copies of homeowner newsletters celebrating the beautiful ponds and flowing fountains that attracted buyers from across the county. She stacked them across the hood of the patrol truck like courtroom exhibits. Every page displayed green grass, sparkling water, and happy families. Not one page showed the well itself. Not one page showed the ranch. Not one page carried my family's name. Watching her organize those glossy papers, I realized something important. Victoria genuinely believed appearances carried the same weight as ownership. She had spent years building confidence around assumptions until those assumptions felt like facts. Meanwhile, inside my office, less than 50 yards away, rows of steel filing cabinets quietly held decades of permits, inspection records, maintenance logs, surveys, and documents that had never needed bright photographs to prove they existed. The deputies had not asked to see any paperwork yet. They were still listening. And for the moment, that was exactly where I wanted the conversation to stay. Deputy Mills looked from Victoria's colorful neighborhood brochures to the open well house without saying a word. The silence stretched long enough for the steady chirping of meadowlarks to fill the air. Somewhere beyond the cattle pasture, a diesel tractor started up with its familiar rumble before fading into the distance. I bent down and lifted the old pressure regulator from the concrete floor. The cast iron housing was coated with years of mineral buildup, its surface rough beneath my gloves. I handed it to the deputy. "This is why the system is offline," I said. "If I force water through this cracked regulator, I could damage the pumps." He examined the worn part with quiet curiosity while Victoria crossed her arms even tighter. "That does not matter," she insisted. "Our residents are paying for services they are not receiving." I met her eyes for only a moment. "Your residents are not my customers." The words hung in the dry summer air. Victoria immediately stepped closer, her voice rising just enough to sound offended rather than angry. "Do you hear that? He admits he intentionally shut off the water." Deputy Mills calmly raised one hand. "Ma'am, I heard him explain that he is performing maintenance." She shook her head. "Maintenance requires notice. He cannot simply shut everything down without permission." I almost smiled at that sentence because it revealed exactly how differently we viewed the situation. She believed I needed permission to work on equipment sitting inside my own building, connected to infrastructure my family had maintained for decades. The deputy looked toward the pump controls mounted on the wall. Their faded paint, handwritten inspection dates, and neatly labeled switches clearly showed they had been serviced for many years. Nothing inside that building looked abandoned or neglected. Every wrench had its place. Every maintenance log rested inside a clear plastic sleeve. Every replacement fitting waited in organized rows on steel shelves. Ranch work rewards preparation because unexpected failures always happen at the worst possible time. Victoria, however, seemed more interested in appearances than evidence. She walked toward the patrol truck again and unfolded another large presentation board displaying the entrance fountain flowing beneath bright evening lights. "This feature represents our entire community," she explained. "Homeowners purchase property expecting reliable water." Deputy Mills studied the photograph before quietly asking, "Who installed that fountain?" Victoria answered immediately, "The developer." "Who maintains the pumps supplying it?" She hesitated for the first time all morning. "Our landscaping contractor." "Who owns the source?" That question landed differently. Victoria did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the eastern ridge as though the well itself might somehow belong to the scenery instead of the land beneath it. "The neighborhood has always depended on this water," she finally replied. Deputy Mills nodded politely, but he did not write anything down. I noticed that detail. He only wrote facts, not assumptions. Standing there beside the weathered pump house, I realized this conversation was no longer about broken equipment. It had become a quiet contest between habit and ownership. Victoria had spent years repeating the same story until everyone around her accepted it without asking where it began. I had spent years quietly documenting every inspection, every repair, every permit, and every gallon flowing through that well. One version relied on confidence. The other relied on records. The deputies had not reached any conclusions yet, but I could already sense which one they were preparing to verify first. Deputy Mills closed his notebook for the moment and looked at both of us with the patient expression of someone who had learned that the loudest voice rarely belonged to the person with the strongest case. The breeze shifted, carrying the earthy smell of dry creek beds and warm mesquite across the yard while a weathered windmill turned one slow rotation above the grazing pasture. Victoria seemed to mistake the silence for agreement. She stepped forward again, speaking with complete confidence. "Our board approved every improvement connected to that water system years ago. We have meeting minutes. We have budgets. We have maintenance invoices. She tapped the folder in her hand, as though paper alone settled every question. I remained beside the well house, wiping my hands with the same faded shop towel my father used to carry in the back pocket of his jeans. Did your board ever ask my family for permission? I asked quietly. She answered without hesitation. It has been this way for years. I nodded once. That was not my question. The deputy noticed the difference immediately. He asked Victoria the exact same question. Do you have documentation showing the owner of this ranch transferred ownership of the well or granted permanent water rights to the homeowners association? For the first time since arriving, Victoria did not respond immediately. Instead, she flipped through her folder with increasing urgency. Color photographs appeared. Annual landscaping contracts appeared. Copies of homeowner newsletters appeared. Financial statements appeared. Everything documented how the neighborhood spent money maintaining ponds, irrigation lines, and decorative fountains after the water left my property. Nothing explained why it had the right to leave my property in the first place. I could almost hear the pages rustling faster than the wind moving through the live oak branches overhead. She finally stopped searching and looked directly at the deputy. The developer handled all of that before the community was established. Deputy Mills simply asked, "Do you have those documents today?" She pressed her lips together. "Not with me." He made another note. I watched carefully because every sentence he wrote seemed shorter than the one before. Facts were replacing assumptions. My eyes drifted toward the steel door of my ranch office, just beyond the pump house. Behind that door sat decades of organized records waiting quietly inside labeled file drawers. My father always believed paperwork should be treated like fence posts. You never noticed them until someone questioned where the property line actually stood. That lesson suddenly felt more valuable than ever. Victoria was still trying to persuade the deputies using expectations. Homeowners expected green lawns. Buyers expected working fountains. The community expected uninterrupted service. Every sentence began with what people expected. Mine began and ended with ownership. Expectations could create disappointment. They could not create legal rights. As the distant sound of another vehicle echoed along the county road, Deputy Mills glanced toward the entrance gate before looking back at me. "Mr. Caldwell," he said evenly, "you mentioned earlier that you keep detailed records concerning this well." I nodded. Every inspection, every permit, every repair, every survey. He gave a small, thoughtful nod in return. "I believe it would be helpful if we took a look at those before anyone reaches conclusions." Victoria immediately objected, insisting there was nothing left to discuss, but I had been waiting to hear that request all morning. Without raising my voice or showing the slightest hurry, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the old brass office key my father had carried for nearly 40 years, and started walking toward the building where the real history of that water had been waiting long before any neighborhood learned how to spell the letters HOA. The old brass key slid into the office door with the same soft metallic click I had heard thousands of times growing up. The room greeted me with the familiar smell of aged paper, pine shelves, and machine oil that had settled into the walls over decades. Morning sunlight spilled through the west window, catching tiny particles of dust floating above 4 gray steel filing cabinets lined neatly against the back wall. My father used to joke that those cabinets were worth more than the tractors because tractors eventually wore out while good records only became more valuable with time. Deputy Mills stepped inside behind me while his partner remained near the doorway. Victoria hesitated outside for a moment before following, her confidence still intact, although noticeably quieter than before. I walked directly to the cabinet labeled water system and unlocked the top drawer. Every folder sat in perfect chronological order. Inspection reports, pump maintenance logs, water quality testing, county permits, survey maps, handwritten notes from my grandfather. Nothing had ever been thrown away. I placed a thick binder on the wooden table and carefully opened the first section. Deputy Mills leaned closer while I turned each page slowly enough for everyone to see. There were inspection stickers dating back decades, receipts for replacement pumps, invoices for electrical upgrades, and signed reports from licensed contractors. Every document listed Caldwell Ranch as the owner of the production well and pumping equipment. Victoria folded her arms again. "Maintenance records do not prove ownership," she said. I nodded because, for once, she was right. They do not. I answered calmly. I reached back into the cabinet and removed a large survey tube. The cardboard cap slid off with a hollow sound before I carefully unrolled an oversized county survey across the table. Heavy brass weights kept the corners flat while the map settled into place. Colored property boundaries stretched across the page, showing every fence line, easement, creek, and utility corridor. Deputy Mills studied it carefully. The production well appeared as a small, blue circle positioned well inside the Caldwell Ranch boundary. More importantly, every underground supply line leaving the well was clearly marked. One line extended east toward Willow Creek Estates. Next to it sat a notation typed in bold capital letters. Temporary agricultural supply connection. Revocable by property owner. Victoria stepped closer, her expression changing almost imperceptibly. "That cannot be correct," she said quietly. I reached for another folder without responding. Inside rested copies of correspondence exchanged years before the subdivision even existed. My father had signed a temporary agreement allowing the developer limited access to water during initial construction while permanent infrastructure was being completed. The agreement included a fixed expiration date only 18 months later. Attached behind it sat another letter reminding the developer that the temporary connection would not create permanent ownership or guaranteed future service. Deputy Mills read both documents from beginning to end before looking toward Victoria. She searched through her own folder once more, but the glossy newsletters and landscaping budgets suddenly looked very small beside decades of official records. The room became completely silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock my grandfather had hung there nearly 50 years earlier. Every second seemed louder than the last. I had not raised my voice once that morning. I had simply opened a filing cabinet. And with every page turned, the story Victoria believed had existed for years was quietly beginning to come apart under the weight of documents that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to read them. Victoria stared at the survey for several long seconds before forcing a smile that looked more rehearsed than confident. "There has to be another agreement," she said, almost to herself. The developer would never have built an entire community without securing permanent water. Deputy Mills did not answer. Instead, he carefully folded the survey back into place and looked toward me. "Is there anything else we should review before making any decisions?" I nodded once and opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside rested a weathered leather binder that looked older than everything else in the room. The edges were worn smooth from decades of careful handling, and a brass nameplate on the cover simply read Caldwell Water Rights. I carried it to the table with both hands. Even after all these years, I still treated it with the same respect my father had. "This is the binder he told me never to lose," I said quietly. "He made me read it every summer until I understood why every signature mattered." I opened the first section. Inside were certified county filings, recorded water rights, correspondence with the regional water district, and renewal acknowledgments spanning generations. One page immediately caught Deputy Mills' attention because it carried the county seal embossed directly into the paper. He read it slowly before asking, "These rights have remained continuously active?" "Every year," I replied. "The inspections, taxes, reporting requirements, and maintenance obligations have all been completed without interruption." He nodded thoughtfully and turned another page. Attached behind the filings sat annual inspection certifications from the Regional Water Authority confirming that Caldwell Ranch remained the registered owner and operator of the production well. Victoria stepped closer, her expression tightening as she followed each page. "Our board has been paying landscaping invoices for years," she insisted. "That has to count for something." I answered without any satisfaction in my voice. "Maintaining the grass after the water reaches your neighborhood does not transfer ownership of the source." The room fell quiet again. Even the old wall clock seemed louder now, marking each passing second with steady confidence. Deputy Mills closed the binder carefully and rested both hands on its cover. "I think we are looking at two separate issues," he said. "One concerns how the Homeowners Association has been operating. The other concerns who legally controls this well." Victoria immediately began explaining that homeowners would be furious if the fountain stayed dry, but the deputy gently interrupted her. "Community expectations do not replace recorded property rights." Those words settled over the room like dust after a long drive down a gravel road. Through the office window, I could see the silent windmill standing above the pasture while sunlight reflected off the metal roof of the pump house. Nothing outside had changed. The only thing changing was the understanding inside the room. Deputy Mills reached for his radio but paused before pressing the button. "Given what we have reviewed," he said, "I believe we need someone from the Regional Water District to verify these records before anyone takes further action." I simply nodded. That was exactly the step I had hoped for from the beginning. I had never wanted an argument. I wanted the right people looking at the right documents. Victoria slowly lowered the folder she had been carrying all morning. For the first time since she had driven onto my ranch, she stopped talking completely. Confidence built on assumptions had finally met records that had been waiting patiently for decades, and the next vehicle coming through my front gate would not be responding to accusations. It would be coming to verify the truth. Less than 40 minutes later, another county vehicle rolled through my front gate, this one carrying the Regional Water District Inspector. His name was Daniel Harper, a quiet man in his late 50s whose boots carried the pale dust of ranch roads instead of polished office floors. He introduced himself with a firm handshake, accepted the binder from Deputy Mills, and asked only one question before opening it. "Where is the original well located?" I pointed through the office window toward the weathered pump house standing beneath the old live oak. He nodded without another word. The inspection became methodical. We walked the property while Daniel compared survey coordinates with a handheld mapping unit. He photographed the wellhead, checked the serial numbers on the pumping equipment, examined inspection plates attached to the pressure tanks, and followed the underground utility map one section at a time. Victoria walked several steps behind us, insisting there had to be another explanation. She repeated that the neighborhood had relied on this water for years, that every homeowner believed the supply belonged to the community, and that shutting it off created unnecessary hardship. Daniel listened respectfully, but every answer he gave returned to the same point. Reliance does not establish ownership. By early afternoon, the Texas sun reflected brightly off the galvanized storage tanks, and the smell of warm metal mixed with dry grass as we gathered once more inside the office. Daniel carefully placed the final document onto the table before looking at Deputy Mills. "The records are consistent," he said. "The production well, the pumping equipment, and the registered water rights remain under Caldwell Ranch. I do not see any recorded transfer of ownership or any permanent conveyance granting exclusive control to the Homeowners Association." The room became perfectly still. Victoria opened her folder one final time before slowly closing it again without removing a single page. Daniel continued speaking in the same calm tone. "The temporary agricultural supply agreement expired years ago according to the recorded documents. If water has continued flowing beyond that period, it appears to have done so through continued permission from the property owner rather than through a permanent legal obligation." Deputy Mills looked toward me. "So shutting down the system for maintenance on privately owned equipment was within your authority?" Daniel answered before I could. "Based on the documentation and physical inspection completed today, yes." The deputy gave a slow nod before turning toward Victoria. His voice remained professional and courteous. "Ma'am, this appears to be a civil matter involving property rights rather than criminal conduct. There is no basis for an arrest here." Hearing those words, I felt no satisfaction, only relief. The entire morning had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about allowing facts to replace assumptions. Victoria stood quietly beside the conference table, staring at the county survey that showed the small blue circle marking the well entirely inside my property boundary. The fountains, ponds, and green entrance lawns she had proudly defended all traced back to that single point on the map. For years she had believed the neighborhood owned the water because nobody had ever challenged the story. Now the records, the inspection, and the law had all reached the same conclusion. The silence that followed carried more weight than every argument spoken since sunrise because, at last, nobody in the room was debating opinions anymore. They were simply acknowledging what had always been true. The deputies shook our hands before leaving, and the water district inspector carefully returned every original document to the leather binder exactly as he had found them. When the last county vehicle disappeared beyond the front gate, the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythm. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth through the open pump house, while cattle wandered lazily across the pasture as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I finished installing the new pressure regulator, tightened the final fitting with the same wrench my father had used years before, and slowly reopened the main valve. The deep mechanical hum returned beneath the concrete floor, steady and familiar, followed by the gentle vibration of water moving through pipes buried beneath generations of family land. A few minutes later, my pressure gauges climbed exactly where they belonged. Everything worked perfectly. The water flowed again because I chose to restore service after completing the repair, not because anyone had demanded it. Several days later, I received a formal letter from the Regional Water District summarizing the inspection and confirming the ownership records exactly as they had been reviewed inside my office. The county also recommended that any future long-term water arrangement between Caldwell Ranch and Willow Creek Estates should be governed by a properly negotiated written agreement rather than assumptions carried forward from an expired construction project. That recommendation made perfect sense to me. Good neighbors build relationships with conversations and contracts, not entitlement. A week after the inspection, the Homeowners Association requested a meeting. This time there were no accusations, no emergency phone calls, and no dramatic speeches. Victoria arrived with 2 board members and a legal representative. The confidence she had carried onto my ranch that morning had been replaced by careful questions and respectful listening. We spent hours discussing realistic options, including conservation measures, infrastructure upgrades, and the possibility of installing an independent production well for the neighborhood. By the end of the meeting, everyone understood exactly where responsibility began and where ownership ended. Months later, the neighborhood completed construction of its own permitted water system. Their fountains eventually flowed again. Their entrance landscaping stayed healthy, and the burden of maintaining someone else's expectations no longer rested on my family's ranch. As for Caldwell Ranch, very little changed. I still walked the same fence lines every morning. I still inspected the same pumps, checked the same pressure gauges, and filed every maintenance record inside the same gray cabinets my grandfather had trusted. The old brass key remained in my pocket, polished smooth from years of use. Sometimes visitors ask why I keep so many records when everything has already been settled. I simply smile and point toward the filing cabinets before looking out across the pasture where the afternoon sunlight glitters on the stock pond. Land remembers. Water remembers. Good paperwork remembers even longer. Looking back now, I realize the most important moment of that entire day was not when the deputies arrived or when the inspector confirmed the records. It was the quiet instant when facts replaced assumptions. Nobody needed to raise a voice. Nobody needed revenge. The truth had been sitting patiently inside a filing cabinet all along, waiting for someone willing to open the drawer. My grandfather used to tell me that real ownership is not measured by who speaks the loudest. It is measured by who accepts the responsibility long after everyone else has gone home. Standing beside the steady hum of that old well, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice did not arrive with flashing lights that morning. It arrived one document at a time, proving once again that patience, preparation, and the truth will always outlast borrowed authority.